Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this discussion sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. My name is Bob Butler, a longtime reporter at KCBS Radio in San Francisco, and we're here tonight with Max Frankel, former executive editor of the New York Times. Max, you've been hailed by the Carnegie Foundation as being one of the 20th century's most influential journalists. You were
Uh-oh.
hired by the New York Times in 1952 and spent 50 years with the country's paper of record, one of two Times correspondents to be assigned to Moscow from 57 to 1960. And after you were in the Caribbean, you reported mostly from Cuba. You moved to DC in 1961, became a diplomatic correspondent in 63 and White House correspondent in 66. You won a Pulitzer Prize in 73 for the stories you wrote covering President Nixon on his trip to China. And you served as the executive editor of the Times from 1986 to 1994. You're here tonight to talk about your incredible career. And I got to tell you, what Adam and I were just talking, and it turns out, I guess your biggest claim to fame is a ship called the Andrea Doria. Can you talk about that and how you heard about it and how that came to be?
Used to have a profession called night rewrite. And I came to work at 8 o'clock at night until 3 in the morning. And one day the city editor comes over about 10 o'clock at night and he says, check this out. Our wire room, which sends out the headlines of the New York Times to ships at sea, was picking up an SOS from a ship called the Andrea Doria. He said, call the Coast Guard and find out what's going on. I called the Coast Guard. They didn't know anything about it. So I went back to the wire room and they said, my God, there are more messages coming in. It was a sort of a running feature on all this traffic at sea, boats saying, I'm an hour away, I'm coming to help, and so on, a whole drama at sea. And I started writing this stuff up. Of course, the Coast Guard caught up with it. But anyway, we had 7 or 8 editions that night as we kept getting more information, and including a 7 a.m. extra in the morning, which was only circulated in the New York Times area in Times Square. But very unusual, at the last minute, for the last edition, they slapped a byline on my story, which we almost never got on Night Rewrite. And I became sort of a hero in the nighttime cruise. And I got a $25 raise from something like $47 to 72 or whatever it was. And I think I came to the notice of the powers that be, and got some pretty good assignments after that.
Amazing. Yeah, I know it's amazing how sometimes it's a quirky thing that gets you noticed.
That's
And you
right.
kept on that. And that was a pretty big story. For those who don't remember, the Andrea Doria was a cruise ship
And the
or
Times
steamer.
had a real prejudice against letting young people do big stories. Uh, People used to get scolded for sending me out on anything that might develop into a big story. Um, so there was a real prejudice to overcome. But
These are your colleagues that were upset, right?
oh, no, we were quite a crew. We called ourselves the most reliable bank in the world, the Rewrite Bank.
Uh-huh.
Uh, it
Yeah.
was Arthur Gelb was a member, and he later became my managing editor. And it was a good crew, very helpful.
Great, great. So look, you were born in Germany in 1930. You
That's
were 3 years
correct.
old when Hitler came to power. You wrote in your memoir, The Times of My Life, that you could have become a good little Nazi in his army. What did
Yep.
you mean by that? Talk about that.
Well, if you're a kid, 6 and 7 years old, and you get all these parades coming by the front of your house with all your classmates, even though the teacher was kind to me and sent me home before we got into these Nazi parades. Um, uh, I wanted to be with them. I wanted to carry a big torch at night. I wanted to sing songs, march behind bands. That's what I meant. I could have been swept up in this whole thing if I weren't Jewish. And as I say, if the teacher hadn't rather kindly let me go home, but looking out my window, it was no fun being left out.
Yeah. So now you and your family, you finally did get out of Germany. How'd you get out?
Oh, that's a very complicated story. We were, my parents were nominally Polish because they were born in a part of Austria-Hungary, which had by then become Poland. And they had stateless passports because Poland didn't recognize them as citizens, and Germany didn't recognize them. So anyway, there were about 20,000 Jews of Polish origin living in Germany, including my parents and my grandparents. And we were all rounded up one night in October of 1938 and dumped on the border. My grandparents were lucky; at least they got into trains and went smoothly across the border. We were literally dumped on the border of Poland, and there were frantic negotiations over our heads as to whether we would be allowed into Poland or not. And we had to sit out there in the middle of the night for a couple of nights until we were finally admitted. And then by a strange ruse, I had an uncle whom I'd never met in the city of Krakow. And he was a chocolate manufacturer. And he was shrewd enough to buy some extra tickets for platform visits so that he could get us off that train that brought us through Krakow and took us into his house. And there I lived with chocolate every night and started learning Polish and went to a Polish Jewish type school. Very complicated, starting in 1939, in other words, 8, 9 months after we were expelled that way, and having left our apartments and our store in the city of Weissenfels in Germany, my mother got permission to go back to Germany, and her only reason for going back was to agitate at the American embassy for, we had been trying for years to get permission for a visa to America. And she finally learned that we did qualify for an American visa, but it wouldn't come through until September. So she liquidated our belongings. She had the Gestapo guys in Germany had been our customers, so she bribed them, and they took good care of protecting our property. And she liquidated it all. She sent off a lot of furniture and stuff. She spent the money off to New York, and she bought passages on a ship for all of us for September 10th. And she came back to Poland, and she said to my father, "Hey, we're ready to go." He said, "I'm not spending 2, 3 months waiting around in Germany." What they were doing to Jewish men by then was pretty rough. So he said, you guys go back, my mother and I, and we did go back in July or August. And we was going to sail. He was going to join us at the last minute, and we would sail from Hamburg on a German ship where she spent the money. Um, and on September 1st, the war broke out. Germany invaded Poland, and now we were separated. And my mother and I were considered enemy aliens in Germany. And she she said the American embassy could not give us the visa because we didn't have an exit visa now that we needed as enemy aliens to get out of Germany. And they said, we don't want to waste this American visa. If you can't get permitted out to leave Germany, we could give that visa number to somebody else who's online waiting to go to New York. Anyway, she very gutsily maneuvered her way around Berlin, figured out where she had to go, couldn't even go on the streets where Jews were not allowed, and presented herself to a head of Gestapo in the city of Berlin, and sort of charmed him into giving us an exit visa. And we went out through Holland, my mother and I, and this time we got a Dutch ship to go, and that was in February 1940. Meantime, my father, when the German army invaded Poland, started running the other way. And I don't know how much history you remember, but the Russians and the Germans split Poland in half under a treaty. So he was arrested because they needed manpower, and they offered him Soviet citizenship, and he said, "Well, I don't, I'll never get out if I do that, and I want to rejoin my family someday." So they brought him up on charges and accused him of being a capitalist merchant because his passport said he was a merchant, and they sentenced him to 15 years in a labor camp in Siberia, and off he went. And they almost killed him there because they were out chopping trees every morning or whatever they were doing, until he was so sick that a Jewish doctor who was running the infirmary took him in and sort of nursed him a little bit back to health. And 2 years later, in 1941, suddenly the Germans invaded Russia. And now Poland and Russia became allies. The Polish government in exile sitting in London arranged for those people in Siberia who had been yanked out of various places to be released if they were still alive. And so my father, among others, got released finally, not from the Soviet Union, but from the labor camp. And he started wandering around looking for things to do. He almost lost some cows and a collective farm and all kinds of strange adventures. But he wound up in far eastern Siberia in charge of 500 German prisoners because he spoke German. He didn't speak much Polish. He was allegedly Polish, but he spoke German very well. So and he's starting to pick up Russian. So he took charge of these prisoners in a veneer factory, and that was like a gold mine because the wood, they could steal pieces of wood coming out of the factory, and he could bribe his landlady, who gave him the seat of honor next to the stove in her Siberian cabin. They were short of men, and he could supply a steady supply of firewood and so on. when he finally got out, it was well after the war, 1946. They were all released back to Poland. And then we could still get in touch with him. And he finally came to New York in 1946. Um,
Wow.
Quite an adventure.
Quite an adventure, quite amazing. So now,
We,
fast forward to 1952, and you got a job at this little newspaper in New York called the New York Times.
yes,
How did that come about?
I got the job actually starting in 1949. There was a fellow at this is all the coincidences of life. I went to the high school of music and art in New York City as
Mhm.
an art student. But I knew that innately I wasn't a great artist. I saw some of these other kids throw paint at canvas and produced marvelous things. I could figure out what makes a good painting, but it wasn't natural to me. And so I was doing very well in all my courses, but there was a problem in English. I I had no basic foundation in reading books. I never had Aesop's fairy tales or anything else that I grew up with, and there was this real shortage in my background. And so when we were in third year of music and art English class, I was supposed to be reading The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And the teacher named Elsie Herman, bless her, uh, she took me aside one day and she said, "You're not reading this book, are you?" I said, "No." I said, "It's no fun. I have to look up every 10th word. It's very painful. I just don't understand it." By the way, I tried that book not too long ago, and it still is difficult. But she said, "Look, there's something wrong here. You are doing brilliantly in all your courses, French and math and everything else, and you're going to have this big hole, this big bad poor grade in English. Um, I've got an idea," she said. Um, the next term, I run the journalism class. And what that class does is they don't read books. They put out a monthly newspaper for the school, and I'm in charge of it. And your grade is not normally good enough to get you into that journalism class, um, but I will make an exception because my theory is that if I get you to write, that you'll start getting interested in reading and you'll learn a lot to read. And so, sure enough, she took me into that journalism class. And the editor of the paper, who was a year ahead of me, was a fellow named David Wise. He had we became somewhat good friends. And in the end, I succeeded him as editor of the paper, of the high school paper. And meantime, he went on to Columbia College in New York City. And then in his second year there, he got a job covering Columbia news for the New York Herald Tribune. And when I came along, he persuaded me to come to Columbia. He said, "I don't know whether it's a good school or not for you, but they got a daily newspaper, whereas you've been working on a monthly, and that's going to be great fun." So he persuaded me, and I got a little scholarship help from New York State, and that made it possible to accept And David was 1 year ahead of me all the time. And
Mm.
suddenly he comes in one day and he says, when I was a sophomore, he says, the graduate student who has been doing this for the New York Times, she just got a job in the society page. That's the only place women were hired in those days.
Right.
Um, and maybe she could talk them into hiring you to become the Times. Actually, he said, I'm not sure. We've got to dope this out. Maybe I want to go to the Times and maybe you can go to the Herald Tribune. Uh, we doped it out. He decided that young people were going to move much faster at the Herald Tribune than at the Times, Stodge's Times. And so he stayed with the Tribune. And she somehow persuaded the Times to hire a sophomore, even though half the Times editors were teachers at the journalism school at Columbia. And
Wow.
they said, well, why shouldn't we take a journalism guy instead of a sophomore? And she very quickly said, well, he works on the school newspaper, on the Spectator. Um, and so you got 50 reporters working for you that way, whereas the journalism students are busy from morning till night. Anyway, they sent me down, they got interviewed, and I was hired in my sophomore year to cover Columbia affairs. And it was a lot of good news. First of all, the coverage in those days was much more intensive of a local school. We covered promotions to department heads and so on. But the real news were conferences at Teachers College, uh, experiments in laboratories, successful scientific developments, and Eisenhower became the president of the university, and he always made news because he was a nascent political career developing. And so they let me cover a fair amount of stuff. I was the only college correspondent who was not paid as a stringer, by the string of measuring how much type you got in print.
Right.
I got a weekly stipend of $20 a week because the flow of news for me was so great that the Times got away with paying me less than if they had paid me by string. Anyway,
$20 a week sounds like a pittance now.
of
How was
course,
it back then?
it was enough for me to once or twice a week um, go out to dinner after filing my stories at the Times. I had this whole routine. I would schedule my classes in the morning. I would work for the Spectator, Columbia Spectator, in the afternoon. I'd gather all my materials and go down to the Times around 5 o'clock, write my stories, and then wait till they're cleared, and then go out to some restaurant in Times Square, meet David coming from the Herald Tribune.
Mhm.
And we were, of course, friendly competitors by then. Uh, his versions of the same, often the same news that I had. And between junior and senior year, the Times, out of the goodness of its heart, said, why don't you come and work the summer as a regular reporter, fill in on the police beat, and covering various cops and robbers and stories and fires and stuff. So I did that, got a press card for the first time,
Mhm.
went back to senior year at Columbia, and finally after graduation, with some tension, I got hired by the Times. It was relatively one of the last college stringers to be hired. Uh, that ceased to be a feeding machine for regular staff reporters.
Mhm.
That was it. Um, I had to pull a whole fast one with my grass board, with my draft board, because I was I had a deferral from the draft for the Korean War um, that was expiring when I graduated. So I went to the draft board and said, "Can I have one more year to get a master's degree in education?" And the draft board very kindly said, "Okay." So then I asked the Times, which wasn't hard, to give me a schedule so that I could have my weekend in the middle of the week, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so I could load up all my classes at Columbia, get a master's degree while doing um, full-time work at the New York Times. And then I went into the Army. Um, that was fun. Uh, and 2 years. But the reason for doing that was that the Times had to hire me back once you have worked for the Times for 1 year and then got
Mhm.
drafted. Whereas if I'd left sooner, who knows whether anybody would have remembered me.
Yeah.
So,
I'm curious, when you were getting your master's degree,
yeah.
did your professors know that you worked at the Times?
Oh, yes.
And how did that go?
The professor was a fellow named David Truman, who's a very distinguished. He got caught up later in all the tension at Columbia, the riots and stuff, and he wound up at the president of Holyoke, but he was a great professor of government, and uh, I had devised this gimmick. I was going to study the assembly district surrounding Columbia because it happened to have a very strange Democratic club that was not quite loyal, that they broke to support Eisenhower for president. And so it was a very interesting uh, club. And I analyzed all the voting patterns in surrounding areas. I did all the analysis on in the statistics lab. We didn't have computer then. I had to punch in all the votes and stuff. And I did interviews and hung around the club and wrote a thesis. Fortunately, I had a lot of night rewrite work so that I could work at the Times and type my thesis at night uh, while doing that. And the Professor Truman was very sympathetic and very
Mhm.
helpful.
The
And
reason I asked that question is because I went back to get my degree. I started school, and after I got hired at the radio station, they kept changing my schedule, and I had to keep dropping out. So when I finally went back, I got into this class, and the professor found out that I worked at KCBS, and now when he's teaching theory, he said, "Well, this is what the book says. How does it really work?" Did you get any experiences like that?
no, not
Okay,
not that.
yeah.
Um,
So
It
now
was
you've been with the Times.
very
You
funny, very funny story, actually. Jerry Nadler, does that name mean anything to you?
Uh-huh.
He
Yeah.
was the chairman of uh, the impeachment committees.
Right.
Um, and I had never met him, even though he's my congressman. And I ran into him at a wedding or something not too long ago, just a few years ago. And I said, "Hello, my name is Max Frankel." He said, "I know you. I read your master's thesis." I said, "Well, that makes two of us." He said, "What happened? How did you get there?" He said, "When I graduated from college, a few of us started organizing and we were going to start running for the state assembly. And I was going to represent that assembly district, and so I found your book in the Columbia Library, and it was very useful analysis of all the different neighborhoods in the district, and very helpful in getting our campaign started. So that was
That was good. That's good. Yeah. So you're at the Times now. Of course, you break the Andrew Doria story, and eventually they make you a correspondent in Moscow. What was that
right.
like?
Uh, it was especially given the resonance of my father's experience
Mhm.
just a few years earlier. I landed in Moscow in 1957, and he didn't leave uh, Russia until 1946. So it was a mere 10 years after he had gone through all that stuff. And of course, we were suspected of being spies, all of us, because most of the Russian reporters in the US were spies. And we had censorship that we had to maneuver around, which was a great discipline. I recommend it for young reporters if they want to figure out how to get certain ideas out, uh, circumlocutions, locutions, if you will. Um, anyway, but life was rough. It was interesting. I had a new bride that I had just married before winding up overseas, and she could get around a little more freely. She was a little less suspect than I, and she could make some friends and learn things about Soviet life. And of course, we experienced going to the market, and we had a chauffeur who had to report on us, and we had a translator in the office. I didn't speak the language. I came in under strange, complicated circumstances. They had thrown out my predecessor, and so I had to learn some Russian on the fly. Um, anyway, writing through the censorship, but it was a fascinating period. It was just as Khrushchev was emerging um, and turning against Stalin and trying to rid himself of the horror of the Stalinist period and condemning half the party, Molotov and all the others, uh, to the dustbin, so to speak, of history. And of course, he acquired dictatorial powers, but it was in the spirit of reform. He released most of the political prisoners from Siberia. There was a great opening up of uh, cultural life, of greater freedom of publishing stories and more modern paintings. And finally, a huge um, effort by Khrushchev to make himself known in the world. He traveled the world. He came to the US. He um, he allowed a whole new increase in tourism. Um, the, the Bolshoi Ballet went to New York. The New York Philharmonic came, Leonard Bernstein came to Moscow. There were lively exchanges of leading American performers. And we were a home base, so to speak, um, for Americans at sea who welcomed a friendly face and a friendly accent. And so we got to meet all these people. And besides covering them, the great sensation was Van Cliburn. I don't know whether that name means anything to
Mhm.
you. He was a brilliant pianist from Texas who had won the first Tchaikovsky uh, piano competition. Um, we learned later. That's my phone, I think. Let me turn that off. Can't talk now. Um, uh, uh, sorry about that.
Okay.
Um,
It happens all the time.
Van, um, we found out later that they had to go to, the judges had to go to Khrushchev and say, can we give the top prize to an American? And Khrushchev said, well, is he the best? And they said, yes. They said, okay, do it. So that was a great sensation. And again, I had discovered before the finals and he was declared the winner, there was this great fuss because he was a handsome young kid, and all the girls were falling in love with him and throwing flowers at him and whatnot at the Moscow Conservatory as he was performing his various stages of the competition. And the Times had made it a front page story saying this young American was causing a sensation in Moscow and, in effect, setting up a challenge as to whether they would let him win. And they did. Anyway, that was a great run of stories. And the opening by Khrushchev and the backsliding back toward Stalinism again, and the occasional lifting of the censorship when big time diplomats came, they lifted the censorship. Nixon came to visit the United States when he was vice president, famous debate in the kitchen. Uh, anyway, um, I did make a name for myself there pretty well. In fact, there's some nice people up at Harvard who said, you know, who is this kid and uh, how come he's catching on to all the stuff, how to read the Soviet hierarchy, what order the portraits were put up on the buildings, told you who was up and who was down. And you know, I learned how to read the communist methods of communicating with each other. The One of my favorite things I used to learn was the Pravda, the newspaper of the Communist Party, would also always start with the great achievements in the heroic harvest of wheat and so on, and you go down the story and to the word agnaka, and that was the paragraph that started however, and there was whenever you got to a however story, you were on to something that had gone wrong in their main harvest or in their economy in general. So you could learn to read them. And I learned to read, ironically, I learned to read the Russian press a lot more easily than I could read Charles Dickens.
Hmm.
And anyway, that was it. Uh, it. At the end of our second year, when we finally got an apartment in Moscow, we had a child. We had the child at home on a home leave after our second year. And when we took him back to Moscow at age 3 months with a supply of Swedish, then paper diapers, which was the brand new invention of that time. And of course, once we had a baby, the Russians were crazy about babies. There was a lot of easy communication with people, and we even took him down to Sochi, to the southern spa area, and got a lot of insights into people's lives that way. Anyway, we had a very successful and rewarding experience. It was hard, but it was very rewarding. And climate, of course, was very tough.
Mhm.
And when we got out, after 3 years, that was about the limit. The I was very eager to go to Germany, to cover Germany. But they wouldn't have it, the powers that be at the times. And they didn't know what to do with me. So then they got this idea that this guy Castro had come to power in Cuba, and there's a big debate as to whether he's a communist or not. And you're now the expert on communism, so why don't you go to Cuba? And they superimposed me on a woman who had inherited the job from her husband. It was mostly a travel story before Castro.
Mhm.
And she was very antagonistic to Castro because she was part of the middle class who had their houses confiscated and whatnot. So they didn't fully trust her. And it was more of a diplomatic assignment, maneuvering around her. But I spent 6 months. By the time I got to Cuba, to go to Cuba, the women and children had already been evacuated, Americans, from Havana. And so I parked them in Miami. And I could still commute every 2 weeks. Every week there was a Pan Am flight from Miami to Havana and back so that I could commute. And I finally got a big interview with the head of the Communist Party, who became eventually the president of Cuba, and Carlos Rafael Rodriguez. And he met me Lenin style, gold cufflinks and fancy shirts, fancy dress for a communist in Cuba who had actually collaborated a lot with the dictatorial regime of Batista before Castro. They joined Castro very late, but he explained the whole psychology to me. And he said, we finally hooked up with Castro because we decided not to go for power for ourselves. We decided to become loyal servants of the Castro movement. And Castro loved that because he didn't like the fact that most of his supporters were Democrats, and they expected civil liberties and freedom of the press and a free debate and free elections. And Castro was not of a mind to let them have that. So he explained now he was teaching Castro Marxism and Leninism, and he was a pretty good student. It was that sort of conversation interview that I had. And when I wrote it up, that was it. That was curtains. They weren't going to tolerate me anymore. Just about the same time, the correspondents in Havana needed decided they needed visas. We used to be able to go in without anything, just an American passport, but they needed visas and they wouldn't give me one. So that was it. That was the end of my Cuban career.
And what year was that?
That was 1960.
1960.
It was, uh,
So going back to when you were at school, Eisenhower was the president of Colombia, right?
that's right.
Okay. And then he runs for president and he wins,
He wins.
right? And then
Yep.
in 1960, Nixon, who you had met when he came to Moscow, runs
Right.
for president
Yep.
against John F. Kennedy.
Yep.
What was the thinking in the country at that time, Nixon versus Kennedy?
Whew. Nixon was Nixon had a reputation of having climbed up to fame, political fame, on the backs of very nasty red baiting campaigns against Democrats in California, and so he was very much disliked by liberal types like me. Um, and Kennedy, of course, was a whole new, fresh generation. He advertised it as a fresh generation. They went hatless. They went invited young people into the administration. They started the Peace Corps, et cetera. So it was a whole refreshing uh, atmosphere. Um, but I remember one day we got a call while I was in Miami, said to come up to Palm Beach. Pierre Salinger was calling, the Kennedy's press secretary, and said the president would like to talk to a few of you correspondents about life in Havana and Castro regime and so on. So I went, and it was the advice that we gave was basically ignore him. That oh, the only thing that you could do is build up Castro in South America as a symbol of anti-Americanism, and you're better off doing nothing. But of course, all of Kennedy's pals behind the scenes were in fact uh, urging an invasion. Um, Kennedy and Nixon both knew that the CIA was preparing uh, an invasion by Cuban emigres um, back to the Bay of Pigs in April '61. And anyway, it's a big fiasco.
Right.
Um,
There was an anchor around Kennedy's neck for a
yeah.
long time. In fact,
Oh,
I'm not sure it was
and
ever.
and I think got him into terrible trouble with Khrushchev, who later thought he could exploit him by putting the missiles in Cuba and
Mhm.
having the Cuban Missile Crisis. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that was
But you're putting all these threads together. I mean, I was very young back in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was what, 8, 9 years old.
yep,
So I look on it today. I didn't look on it then. It was nothing. My my most lasting memory of Kennedy is when my fifth grade teacher came in and said we were all going to go home for school early because the president had been assassinated. That's what I remember most about Kennedy.
yep,
But in all the stories that you've covered, you were at the times in the early 70s when Nixon was president.
yes,
And then these two young reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, stumbled across this story of Watergate.
They
Was
sure
this
got.
a case? You said that they didn't like to give these young reporters good stories. Was this a case where they thought this was going to be a nothing burger and gave it to these two guys to look up?
Well, it looked like a strange robbery at the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic Party. Um, but no, the reason the Post beat the pants off us on that story is that they had local police contacts,
Mm,
and they could get three steps ahead of us every time. Um, we were barely keeping up. We couldn't do it. Um, and they learned where the story was going, and they kept pursuing it. And then, of course, finally, they got a source right inside the FBI, uh,
mhm,
who was the deep throat uh, uh, tipster that
mhm.
met Woodward in a garage every few nights, and kept him going on the story, and we fell hopelessly behind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've heard Woodward and Bernstein speak about it. And, if it hadn't been for Mark Fell, that would have been a nothing burger story.
Yeah.
Is there one story that you've covered that had a lasting impact on you? I know it's hard I mean, people ask me that question, and I have so many stories.
Of course. Uh,
Yeah.
they all seem to fall almost at the right time in my life, so that I could keep learning. Could even as an editor, uh, writing editorials and stuff. I could keep surrounding myself with smart people from whom I learned a hell of a lot. But I think the formative experience of a 27-year-old in Moscow uh, was just extraordinary, because what happened was that I came home and started applying the same skepticism to Washington stories that I had learned to express in Moscow, and that don't accept things at face value. Learn how to read between the lines. Put yourself in the shoes of the people you're covering, and figure out what they would be doing and why, and that way get one step ahead of the story. Uh, that kind of almost intuitive reporting, and then very tightly measured writing through the censorship uh, combined uh, gave me habits of mind and of journalistic techniques that I could never have acquired anywhere else
Mm.
uh, so well and so quickly, even without the language over there. And it was just a very special time. Um,
Yeah. In your view, how has journalism evolved since the days that you were writing stories? And I know you've been out of the game for 30 years, but what do you think of the journalism you see today?
I think the investigative urge at the Times and other places is encouraging and is much greater than we knew it to be in our time. Even though we had, Woodward and Bernstein, and we had um, the My Lai stories out of Vietnam,
Mhm.
um, but the investigative urge to find things that were wrong and to apply them not just in government, but in science and in business and so on is very encouraging, and I think a great gain. At the same time, the economy of the business has wrecked it. um, so that very few places can afford to practice the kind of expensive investigative journalism that we all prize. And I don't know where it's going to wind up. The New York Times doesn't cover New York anymore, except in very special circumstances. I think it has more subscribers in California than it does in New York and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it's a terrible collapse. And I don't know how it's all going to reconfigure itself. Uh,
I experienced it firsthand. In 2007, one of our colleagues was killed in Oakland, and none of the newspapers, radio stations, TV stations had the capacity to do that story by itself. So
yeah,
we ended up creating a project to do the reporting, similar to the Arizona Project for Don Bolles in 1976.
yeah,
And I don't think that hasn't changed. Thank you, Craigslist.
exactly.
Yeah. When you look at what happened with the rise of Hitler, we've had a lot of rhetoric regarding the current administration and what's happening now. Do you see any parallels?
I see parallels to what I grew up with, it not only in Germany, but in Cuba, um, where systematically uh, democratic institutions and democratic colleagues of Castro's were being cut off at the knee, and slowly but surely, forms of totalitarian took over. Now, I'm reluctant to draw them too tightly, these parallels, because I always believed in my American enthusiasm after coming here as a refugee, that the institutions of American life would always rally to support democratic freedoms. But I did some teaching after a while, after retiring at Cardozo Law School on the First Amendment and so on. I discovered that the First Amendment freedoms were very hard won and came very late. Not really until Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, and then under Earl Warren, uh, did did they become, through the Pentagon Papers and the New York Times v. Sullivan, other forms of protection for for free speech and free speech and free press. Um, and so I'm not sure. I'm not sure that when I see how the Zions of the Republican Party today are behaving, where is George Bush? Where the Bush Republicans in Texas have no quarter for Trump, but why aren't they standing up and resisting what he's done to their party? It's very hard to understand. And of course, Trump has learned. He learned from his first term how not to do it, and he learned to have a money bags with him so that he could threaten anybody with almost a total political annihilation uh, in elective office. Um, so we'll see. Courts are our last resort, and this Supreme Court was not very promising initially. But I do see parallels, yes.
I mean, people have said that Trump wants to be a dictator. He's authoritarian. He wants to be a king.
Yeah.
Do you think all those things are true?
I think he has that narcissistic streak in him. And it is true But, you know, we've always been saved. Huey Long wanted to be dictator in America, and he was assassinated in Louisiana. Joe McCarthy had the potential of becoming a dictator in the Eisenhower era, and dominating the Republican Party even in the age of Eisenhower. But fortunately, he was a drunk. And fortunately, Trump, although he learned his lessons well and is a better salesman than he used to be, and knows he needs Musk's money to kind of threaten everybody around. But fortunately, he's dumb. He has no real policy sense. He has no historical sense. He has no sense of what this country is all about. And all he knows is how to flatter and sell. So we may luck out. We may be saved again by that fact. But
Well, his first term, he had people around him that were loyal to the Constitution and not to him.
that's right.
It don't seem like that's the case this time. That the
Yeah,
people
and
who are around him are loyal to him.
where are they? You know, General Malley is being humiliated in the Pentagon. And where is John Mattis to speak up for these people? Um, I just don't understand this complete collapse into fear in, in the good side of the Republican Party. Um, I don't get it.
Yeah.
Nobody's willing to give up a Senate seat because they want to speak up and stand for right things. I don't know.
Well, we were supposed to go an hour. It's after 4 o'clock, after 7 o'clock. I really appreciate you taking the time. One last question,
Sure.
um, two last questions. If you were in the White House and you were questioning Trump, would you be more like um, somebody from a network that supports him, or would you be like someone like Jim Acosta who formerly from CNN, who took no guff?
I took no guff, but I had a not dissimilar experience, but it was totally different covering Lyndon Johnson because here was you know, great achievements and the Great Society on the one hand, and the Vietnam tragedy on the other. When I first arrived at the White House, Lyndon Johnson thought for sure that I'd been sent over from covering foreign affairs to the White House so as to further cause him trouble in Vietnam. And he's tried to woo me, offering interviews and whatever. And I had a tough time sort of finding my footing, rejecting most of the intimate, off the record interviews and stuff, um, until he could see what I was beginning to write, um, that I had a fairly balanced view of him. Um, I But it was very different. The New York Times was such a big thing in the firmament of communication that everybody from Moscow to Havana to Washington read the New York Times. And so you were a principal instrument of communication. Nixon, after the Pentagon Papers, he didn't want to take us to China. Um, you know, finally, Kissinger persuaded him, said, this is your great international achievement. And the New York Times is the universal means of serious communication among governments. You got to let the New York Times go. So, all right, he gave us one seat, whereas, CBS had about 6 or 7 with technicians and vice presidents
Mhm.
and whatever.
Yeah.
It's so it's very different being the New York Times person at the White House then, and even among all the print journalists, I was there were at least a dozen of us who were important to.
You won a Pulitzer for covering Nixon's trip to China.
Yes.
Um, I said one question, but what do you think the White House press corps should be doing right now? Not the administration has banned the AP because it won't call it the Gulf of America.
Yeah. Well, I think you got to fight them. You got to you got to keep doing what you're doing, what you think is right, and what the right name of the Gulf is, and the hell with them. If they don't let you in,
Does that would that include just not covering the White House now? Because you're not going to get the straight scoop.
well, you're not going to get the straight scoop anyway. um, no, it's important. I used to stand up. We'd have private briefings. Walt Rostow during the Vietnam War would have a private briefing, and he would denounce Senator Fulbright because he was an opponent of the war, and so on. And I'd stand up and said, "I'm not going to do this anonymously. You're not going to. The White House is not going to accept anonymous accusations of senators betraying the war effort. You want to put it on the record? That's fine. Um, okay, so you're not invited anymore to these off the record briefings. You had to do it that way and fight them back with whatever means you had. Um, and you could always catch up. The AP can catch up with what's going on in the White House. Um, and in any case, the mob that is now represented by the technological gear that you see on a sidewalk or outside the White House when somebody comes out to speak um, is nothing like the atmosphere that we worked under back in the 50s and 60s, when you could still walk around the White House while assigned there and, call up Bill Moyers or somebody else and have a conversation with them. You could walk around the Pentagon and the State Department. I loved working Saturdays because that's when the top people would come in certain polo shirts instead of tie, and do extra work without the secretaries, etc. And you could wander to the place, drop in on people, have a meaningful, real conversation about something. So that's all changed. You're now one of 200 people at any place and shouting out questions and so on. It's a terrible atmosphere now in which to work.
Given that, if you had a young journalist come to you and say, "Give me some advice," what would you tell them? Somebody that wants to be a journalist nowadays, what do you tell
Learn something special. I don't care whether it's food or microbiology or diplomacy or whatever it is. Bring some expertise to the job. Bring bring languages and bring and then I would say try to figure out whose career you would like to pattern yourself after. and do the best of copying what they do. Study, in my case, it was James Rustin was the great hero. And I analyzed his stories literally. Do you begin paragraphs with the word however or but, and etc.? How do you hook one paragraph into the other so that they wouldn't cut your story in the middle? All kinds of tricks and efforts. And that was it. And because he wore bow ties, I'd wear bow ties. It was a complete imitation routine.
Yeah.
By the way, my first editor at Columbia Spectator, when I first reported for work in 1948, was named Bob Butler. And he became a distinguished gerontologist. He started the whole trend of a special branch of medicine for treating the elderly. And he started a big institute at NIH and then moved to New York and Mount Sinai. Anyway, it's a great hero of mine, one of my first heroes.
We're not to be confused. Mr. Frankel, I can't tell you how amazing this has been, hearing your stories, just being able to talk with you. I mean, you obviously are a giant in the industry, and we're going to this meeting was being recorded. It's going to go up on the SPJ YouTube site, so people, if they want to see it, can go there and see it. If you want to see how you did, you can go there and look at it. But I want to thank you for a very engaging hour and 15 minutes that we've had to talk with you about your life and your career. Any last words you'd like to offer?
It's been a great experience. I enjoyed it. I'm stumbling over words a little more than I used to, but anyway, I used to be more fluent.
I've been doing that my whole career, so don't worry about it.
It was
I hope
great
you have a nice
talking to
evening.
you.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, really.
All right.
Best.
Take care now.
Talk to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.